To let you know, I've spent the last 2 days grading 100 freshman essays. If my grammar is broken and my syntax distorted, assume that it was catching. This infant talk shall consist of 6 parts. By way of introduction, I was walking around, so I've been here, I don't know, 10 minutes or so I have actually seen the world. And I spoke with a handful of people as I was going around, and Richard said to me something particularly, that struck me particularly as relevant and a good way to start, because we were looking at one of the maps, and I was saying how much I like them, and I do. I love maps, and I've really enjoyed looking at these. And I made some kind of comment about maps, and he said, oh, but you'll never find your way using these. And while he's right, I would argue that that's something I would say about all maps. I am baffled that people use the incredible, beautiful, sophisticated, and nuanced art form that is mapping for something so pedestrian as getting to where they're going. I certainly never do. And I don't think most of us do, and I think the vast majority of maps that exist are not for that purpose. The vast majority of maps exist for entirely other purposes. They exist to beautify, to entertain, to educate, to provide contemplative spaces and places that are their own, not replicas of other spaces and places, but their own spaces and places. So, there is the introduction. Part 1, world building. I've been reading a book lately called Building Imaginary Worlds. The author's name is Wolf. And he looks at a number of systems and processes by which authors and artists, filmmakers, video game designers establish worlds. He looks at everything from the Star Trek universe, which exists across 500 hours of television, 11 films, and a seemingly infinite number of novels, video games, and so on. And all of those things together combine to form a not quite cohesive world. And the one thing he doesn't bring up in this book, which astonishes me, is maps. Because when we want to build an imaginary world, one of the first things we do is we construct the map thereof. Now, these maps are, as I understand it from conversations I had over the summer, inspired by, based upon, and in some cases layered over actual maps. Layered over maps of our own rivers that flow right by Chico. And so there is a core, a root within our world. One of the things that makes mapping consistently powerful is that, unlike many other forms of art, there is a theoretical connection to the world we live in. There's a theoretical connection to our own lived experience and the possibility that maps always present for us to travel. And so these maps are, on the one hand, part of a world that we recognize, but on the other, as Jim and Sheri have layered over them, drawn on them, cut them up, fragmented them, changed their orientation, shifted them, displaced them, exploded them, recombined and reconnected them, they've taken that world that we might know and made it something else. In Wolf's terms, this is an overlaid fictional world. Not a wholly created fictional world, but one that sits on top of the world we know and recognize, and yet distorts it in ways that cause us to rethink it anew. So, world building. I didn't check what time I started. Did anyone? An hour ago. An hour ago. So,
I think beyond an hour, I think about a minute in America.
It's a New York minute. I just got started. So, from overlaid worlds to layers. Because one of the things that seems really central to how these are constructed, particularly the ones that are running along these low panels along this side, are layers. I was put in the mind of a passage from one of my favorite novels, a novel by Joanna Sinisalo called Troll, a Love Story. The students who are in my Monsters class are all going to read this. It's great, right? It's great. She didn't think she was going to like it, but it's great. She has this wonderful passage that has nothing to do with trolls or love. where she's talking about cities. And she says, and pardon me, I'm paraphrasing, there are cities and there are cities, and there are cities within cities. And then she goes on to describe two walks along the same street. And she says that when we walk along the streets, we do not perceive the same things. We perceive separate worlds even though we occupy the same space. And so she says, for example, that a certain fashionable kind of woman, that's her phrase, will perceive certain things along this one street, set in Finland. She will see a certain kind of store that sells a certain kind of product. She will see certain kinds of cafes where certain kinds of lunches can be had. But she says that a homeless drunk passing through that same space will not only not have a use for, but will not see the stores she saw, will not see the cafes she saw. He will see instead the last bar where they will extend him credit. He will see an alley where he can urinate without getting arrested. The point is that these cities sit directly on top of one another. They're the same city, and yet they're not. And none of us can experience truly a city in its totality. We will only ever perceive it as a series of layers. We travel with our friends. When we walk around with our children, we see whole different cities. When we have guests in town, we see buildings we never noticed were there. And so when I was looking at these images, what I was seeing were maps underlaying transparencies, underlaying visual images, underlaying often, particularly, things that look like boats. Modes of transportation, ways of getting around. And so the river, for me, has always and only been an aesthetic experience. I stand on the banks and I watch it go by, and it's beautiful, and I have never been on it. I understand people who go out on it kill fish. So I stay on shore. But Jim's experience of the river is entirely different from mine, and I would have to admit, far more deep, rich, nuanced, and careful. And I think this comes out as we look at the ways that he has built up a fragmented experience, not a whole, not a complete, because that's not how we experience space. One of the things that maps do is they force artificial coherence onto space that we experience in broken pieces, in episodes, in flashes, like a dance floor under a strobe light. Yes, never the whole motion, never the complete, never the connect. That's how we experience the world, and yet when we look at the maps, there they are, all cohesive, all connected. And so I like the way they've broken this up. These were, I believe, based on aerial photographs of the areas. And the aerial photographs can be stitched together, but they're not, right? They come in a stack, not in a roll. But they've been redivided here instead of put together, giving us that sense that we get as we go, following the bends, following the bends, following the bends, from one curve to the next, always broken, always fragmented, never getting a sense of the entire river, which, of course, we could never. So, as we look at these runs of the river, these bits, these segments, Part 3, orientation. So one of the key things about maps, one of the things that is so obvious that we often don't even perceive that it's there, is the orientation. What does this word mean? Students who have suffered through my courses, what does it mean to orient a map? Break the word in half, it's easy. The first part is orient. Yeah? To orient means to face to the east. That's what all maps used to do 1,000 years ago. In Europe, all maps face to the east. Well, the direction we face our maps matters vitally. Italo Calvino, wonderful novelist, wrote a sort of memoir, I guess it is, called The Road to San Giovanni. And he begins with a phrase that's always stuck with me. He says, if we are to understand the world and the course of its history, we have to begin with the way my house was situated. Yes? This highlights actually two of the things I want to talk about. One is orientation, and the other, the last thing I want to talk about, which is scale. So don't let me forget to go back to Calvino when we get to the scale. But orientation matters because everything we see from a perspective. We see it from an angle. There is no natural or neutral perspective we can take to the world. And whenever we map it, we are mapping our perspective. Now, we can do that passively, or we can grip that by the horns and do it and bend it toward our aim, our purpose. As I looked around, one of the things that struck me was these constant shifts. And the first thing I thought when I saw these two is, well, of course, they fit together. But why should they? And these wonderful, exploded drawings with their little bits and fragments that from a distance look like a hieroglyphic script written across the wall, which therefore, just like hieroglyphs, promise you meaning, but when you get there, I don't know about you, I didn't take hieroglyphics in college. A friend of mine used it for her foreign language requirements as an undergraduate. I did not. Latin. Equally useful. And so, from a distance, they promise meaning, they promise writing. And the ones that are on the back wall, behind this wall, are even formatted like the pages of a manuscript. They have paragraph indents, and they end off, and some of them even seem to have little bits of signatures following off on the end. They are playing with being text, but they're playing with the fact that the landscape itself is a writing, right? When we talk about a landscape is not the natural world, right? A landscape is what we've done to the natural world. The natural world exists, but it's only once we've made a painting, a drawing, a photograph, a map, that we've taken that landscape and turned it into, taken that natural space and turned it into a landscape that systematizes it for us, that makes it intelligible for us. And so to take that one step further and make it into something that looks like writing, that is to say, the sort of ultimate sign of human systematization of knowledge, seems to me a beautiful and perfect way to handle it. But then as we get closer, what we see is these little bits, these little pieces, these little fragments are all of them out of joint. And the meaning that it promises, it doesn't deliver. They're all in constantly shifting orientations. And so again, while they break up the way that maps usually function, they're in that sense closer to what we actually experience. Good. Okay. 2 more points. Accuracy and scale. Accuracy. Dennis Woods tells us, cartographic historian, cartographic theorist, he says, there is nothing natural about a map. The map does not show us the world, he says. It shows us a slice of the piece of the world. Not the world as it is, but through a glass darkly. Maps never show us the world. Maps always and inherently and by necessity of their very nature must distort the world. And so what do we actually get? We get either ideology or personal reflection, emotion, but never accuracy, and we should love that about maps. And so when we see what I see as Jim's experience floating down the river, when we see his boats, when we see this wonderfully taut, tense, energized, energetic re-inscription of the landscape, what we're getting is no more and no less accurate than the very maps that these would be based upon, than the very standard maps that you would be used to looking conventionally. These are just as accurate as those, if not, in their own way, more so. And finally, scale. What did I say I wanted to get back to? Well done. So if we're to understand the world in the course of its history, we begin with my house, right? So, the world, as big as it gets in the course of its history, that's the grand sweep of everything, right? But then we begin with my house. Because that's what it's always about, right? It's always about the negotiation between the micro-local and the global. How much space can a map cover? There are maps of the entire universe. I mean, they're hard for us to wrap our heads around. Our minds don't really hold that kind of data. But we can do it. We can map the universe. We can also map the human genome. Something so small we can't even contemplate seeing it. So small that the photographs that we can now take of it do not have color, not because they can't, but because at that magnification, color no longer means anything. The spaces are smaller than the wavelengths that compose color. So we can map on those two ends of the spectrum. But no matter how big the scale of the map, the subject is always the same. The subject is always us. And so, Richard said that these maps certainly won't help you find anything, but, and I say this with all due deference and respect, yes they will, they have, they helped us. They helped us all. We found each other. We found each other tonight. We found beautiful works of art. Thank you all very much.